On this episode of the podcast, I have a conversation with Sean Anderson and Michael Ness. This is an epic conversation. Not only do we cover Sean's journey into Mormon fundamentalism, but we go into depth on the Council of 50. We cover what the council was, what its purpose was, and dispel some common misconceptions about the council. Finally, we debunk a new idea gaining ground with young Mormons, that the law of consecration and united order is simply socialism with a religious bent. We do this by digging into the scriptures and seeing what the Lord has to say about the law of consecration and united order. Then we do an A-B comparison of the law of consecration versus socialism. So buckle up for an epic conversation on this episode of the Mormon Renegade Podcast. All right, well, I'm here today with Sean Anderson and Michael Ness. And fellas, first off, let me just tell you, I appreciate you both being here. I know you guys are busy. You have families. You got stuff you got to take care of. But the fact you took time out of your evening to talk to me is, I can't tell you how much that means. So we've kind of talked to Michael before and kind of got his backstory about who he is and how he came to be a fundamentalist. Sean, how about you? Were you always a fundamentalist or?
No.
No?
No, I wasn't. I was kind of in a Jack Mormon family.
Okay.
And you can say I became a fundamentalist when I was 13.
Wow, that's a young age. How did that happen?
Well, that's kind of a long story, but I'll try to be as brief as I possibly can. I was born and raised in Mexico. And my dad was from Salt Lake City. My mother was from the mountains of the state of Durango in Mexico. And my dad was divorced. He had 3 daughters. And when he met my mother, she was a widow and she had 3 daughters. So I have 3 American sisters and 3 Mexican sisters. And between them, there was 4 of us that were the mix or the biracials. And but anyway, Dad wasn't what you would call typically religious. I mean, he believed in God and he believed in what he believed in, but he wasn't very church going. And he used to smoke and he used to like a drink or two, and he could swear like a sailor. So he wasn't what you would call a typical Mormon, to say the least. But we had our periods of activity growing up. I remember the first period of activities when I was about 6 years old in El Paso, Texas. Then we went inactive, and we didn't become active again until I was about 10 years old in Marana, Arizona, and that's where I was baptized. And I was baptized at the age of 10. And we went down, the baptism actually took place in Tucson.
Okay.
And when I was still 10 years old, we moved back down to Mexico. And we moved down to the state of Nayarit, which where I lived there was about a 5-hour drive north of Puerto Vallarta. So we were and the first town that we moved to was close to the west coast there on the Pacific. After about a year and a half, we moved from that town and we actually moved to the coast, to a town by the name of San Blas, Nayarit. And to give you a little historical context, San Blas Nayarit, back in the late 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, even into the 1800s, was the largest port on the West Coast, and that included even American cities at the time. But anyway, so that kind of gives you an idea of where I was. And as I told you before, we weren't very active. But at an early age, I got a testimony of the prophet Joseph Smith. And when the first time I read his first vision, I was hooked on it. So I was always kind of inclined to any opportunity I had to learn more about him, I took it. But anyway, when I was 12 years old, we were living in the town of San Blas Nayarit. And I was enrolled in a government school. It was they called it first of secondary down there, but the equivalent is 7th grade. when I was in the 7th grade, there was another kid that was similar to me. He was also biracial. His mother, like me, was Mexican, but his dad was from Switzerland. And his name was David Schellenberg, or we used to call him down there David Schellenberg. But anyway, we kind of gravitated towards each other because both of us experienced some bullying because of our racial makeup. And the fact that both our fathers were foreigners. But anyway, so we kind of gravitated towards each other and became friends, and we started a conversation about religion, and he asked me, "What religion are you?" And I told him I was Mormon. And he said, "Really?" I said, "Yeah." He says, "So am I." And I said, "You are?" And he goes, "Yeah." And he says, "I never see you at a meeting." And I said, "I didn't know we had a church down here."
Oh.
And he says, "Well, that's understandable. We meet in somebody's house."
Okay.
And it's a small branch. And so he invited me to attend meeting with him the following Sunday. And so I decided I'd go. And that's when I met with his parents and some of his other family members. But anyway, we went to the church, and after a while, I started attending every Sunday, but I was the only member of my family that did. And during that time, the deacons quorum was made up of David Schellenberg and myself. That was it. We were the deacons quorum. So aside from passing sacrament every Sunday, there wasn't much for us to do. And so we wanted to be more involved. And so we pastored the missionaries and asked if we could tag along with them when they went canvassing. And they were reluctant to let us, but they caved in. And so they let us go with them with a condition that we would stay quiet and pay attention and not speak out of turn. So we agreed to do it, and we would put on our Sunday best, which just amounted to a white shirt and a tie. So we went with the elders, and when we were sitting in the living room talking to these people, this lady was expressing some concerns, and the elder misunderstood her. But he wasn't aware of it. And I could see that it was just getting worse. And so I finally raised my hand and I said, "Elder, what she means to say is this. That's what she's saying to you." And he looked at her and says, "Is this true, sister?" And she said, "Yes." And he says, "Oh, I thought you were talking about something else." Now, he spoke Spanish, but he wasn't that familiar with a lot of the colloquialisms.
Gotcha.
And so we ended up going a few more times with them. They kind of liked having me along because I could kind of smooth things over for them. And one of them got the idea to actually ordain us as missionaries. And
really?
Right. But what he said was, I think he was kind of, I don't know if he was very serious about it or just kind of to give us something to do. But we were told to go out, bear our testimonies, say that we were representatives of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And if people showed any interest in meeting with the elders, that we were to write down their names and addresses.
Okay, so they're using you to find people.
Right, people
Gotcha.
That were interested, basically qualified leads. So David Schellenberg and myself, we went about to do that. And we were pretty zealous about it, so we knocked on an awful lot of doors, and people were less reluctant to throw us out because it was kind of a curiosity. What are these two boys doing?
Right.
And so we started jotting down quite a few names. Because people became genuinely interested because we would bear a testimony of the faith, and so we'd have this list of names and addresses to the elders, and they started having a great deal of success. So much so that we quickly ran out of room in that house for meeting.
Wow.
And people would have to. There was a small garden in the front part of this house. They didn't really have a yard to speak about. It was kind of a small garden. And they'd open up the big window and they'd listen in through the window as the meeting progressed.
Wow.
But anyway, as apparently word of this got out, that it got the attention of the local Catholic priest.
Uh-oh.
And through our friends at school, this Catholic priest wanted to meet with us boys, because he wanted to see if there's any truth to this that he was hearing. David Schellenberg told his parents about it, and they advised him not to go. I didn't bother to tell my parents, and so I ended up going, but I went by myself. I didn't have David Schellenberg with me. And so I talked to my friends. I says I'd be willing to go, and they gave me a time when the priest would meet with me. So I went there, and there was a cathedral in the center of the town, and they had a plaza right in front of it, across the street. And then they had a big wall with a big iron gate at the front of it. Then you walked in, and there was garden and grounds around the cathedral. So I walked in there, and they had me sit down on, I can't remember if it was a stone bench or a cement bench, but I just know it wasn't made out of metal, and it wasn't made out of wood. But it was either cement or stone, but I can't remember that detail right now. So I sat there waiting, and the Catholic priest came out, and he had on a black robe and a white collar. And I would say he was a man in about his 50s or so. And he sat down on the edge of the same bench that I was sitting on. And he had a big Bible with him that I would say was about that big, and it was written in italics, and it had a lot of iconography in it. It looked very Catholic.
Bringing out the big guns for you.
Yeah. And then he told me his name, but I can't remember it anymore. But he said, "I'm Father so-and-so, and who are you?" And I gave him my name. And he says, "That sounds like a foreign name." I says, "Well, it is." "And how do you get a name like that?" I says, "Well, my dad's American, and I have his last name, and he wanted to name me after Sean Connery." So that's where I get my name. But anyway, he begins to tell me, he says, "Well, I'm here to tell you that your prophet's a false prophet."
Ooh.
And I says, "Which one?" He says, "Well, the original one, Joseph Smith." And I said, "Really? And how's that?" And he told me that, well, he used to preach that men can become gods. And then he read off a couple of scriptures where it says that there's only one God, but he started off with the 10 Commandments, where it says, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." And then he quoted from Isaiah, and he quoted from a couple of places that we only have one God. He was surprised to find out that I had read the Bible already. And the reason I had read the Bible already is because on my mother's side, I have about 3 aunts that were Jehovah's Witnesses. And when I was 8 years old, they gave me a Bible for Christmas. And they really admonished me to read it. I don't know if you're familiar with Jehovah's Witnesses and what sticklers they are about memorizing scripture.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I read the Jehovah's Witness Bible. That was the first Bible I read. But and then I went through, and I started reading the King James Version. And actually, when I was living in Mexico, it wasn't the King James Version. It was the Spanish version, which is Casiodoro de Reina. And well, it struck me right away at the beginning of the Bible, because I said to the priest, I says, "Well, if there's only one God, why does God say, 'Let us make man in our image'?" And then he gave me the explanation that because they are a 3 in 1, the Trinity doctrine, he can speak plurally, although they are one. Well, that didn't satisfy me when he said that to me. And then I says, "Well, the serpent said to Adam and Eve that they wouldn't surely die if they partook of the fruit. but that they would become as the gods, knowing good from evil. And he says, well, that's clearly the devil speaking, and so therefore that doesn't count. I says, but then why does God say the man has become as one of us, knowing good from evil? Well, again, he goes back to his same explanation that he did for the previous scripture. Well, the next scripture that I quoted was Psalms 82. The one in English, it reads, God standeth in the congregation of the mighty, among the gods he judgeth. But in Spanish, it reads even better. In Spanish, it literally says, God standeth in the congregation of the gods, amongst the gods he judgeth.
Wow.
And then, further down, it says, ye are gods. And well, he told me that what that meant was that God was speaking to the judges of Israel, and as the judges of Israel, they stood as God. They stood as God to the people. So therefore, he wasn't out of line saying, ye are gods. And after that explanation, I said, but that doesn't line up with the way Jesus interpreted that scripture.
Right.
And then he says, what? And I said, you go to John chapter 10, and it says, Christ said, I and the Father are one. And the Jews picked up stones again to stone him for many of these. And he says, many good works have I shown to thee of my Father. For which of these do you stone me? And the Jews replied, for a good work we stone thee not, but for blasphemy, because thou being a man, makest thyself God. And Jesus answered them, saying, is it not written in the law, ye are gods? In your law, ye are gods. And if he called them gods to whom the word of God came, the scripture cannot be broken, something to that effect. I'm paraphrasing more than I'm quoting here. But anyway, at that point, this priest just closed his door. He closed his Bible. And then he says, I'm just wasting my time with you. He says, you can see yourself out. So I did, I left. Well, I didn't think much about it. And a couple of weeks later, my buddies in school, they put a stack of, there were thin pamphlets, but they gave me a stack about that thick and put it on my desk. And they said, what are you going to do with that, Mamon? And Mamon is, they had a play on words with it. Mamon literally means sucker, but they use it more to say that you're a pain in the butt.
Gotcha.
And, but it sounds close to the word Mormon in Spanish, which is mormon. So they used to call us mamones. If they saw Mormon missionaries, they would yell out, ahí van los mamones.
Okay.
So that's how they refer to us, as mamones. And,
so you're saying there could be missionaries today down in Mexico who thinks they know our names, but that's not what they're saying.
Troublemakers or
a pain in the butt,
okay.
Because they say, no seas mamon, like, don't be a pain in the butt,
Right.
Well, anyway, apparently this, my conversation with the priest caused him a little concern. And so he must have somehow got, some anti-Mormon literature. And I didn't know anything about Gerald and Sandra Tanner at the time, but when I think back on it, it sounds almost like their type of writing. But I couldn't tell you if it was their stuff or not. But anyway, so when I got home, I started reading these pamphlets. So that was the first time that I became aware of the fact that Mormons taught the principle of plural marriage, the Adam God doctrine,
Right,
and the segregation of Israel. Those are the things that jumped out at me when I was reading this. And my first inclination was, they don't teach us this in church. These are just a bunch of lies. And so they, but for some reason, it's like I couldn't shake it, get it out of my mind. In all my quiet moments, I started, what I read would keep coming back to mind. And it concerned me enough that I finally asked, I prayed and I asked God, why can't I have peace over this? Why is it bothering me so much? And I felt inspired at that time to reread these pamphlets, but ignore the commentaries. Just read where they quoted from Joseph Smith, from Brigham Young, from John Taylor. So I did that. I ignored the commentaries and went just to the quotes and read only the quotes. And when that happened, I had that same burning sensation in my bosom that I had and when I heard the account of the first vision of Joseph Smith, and when I started reading the Book of Mormon. And I prayed about it. And when I prayed about it, I had a dream and a vision of Jesus being followed by women.
Wow.
Where they would like comb his hair, brush it. They would attend to him and things like that. Basically what a wife would do.
Right.
And for the first time, it dawned on me, Jesus was married. And then I remember reading the Bible, and it dawned on me that, well, Abraham was a polygamist, Jacob was a polygamist, and the next thing I know, I realized a lot of the prophets in the Old Testament were polygamists. And I became so excited about it that I went up to my mother and I told her, Mom, did you know that a man having more than one wife is actually a law of God? And she looked at me and she said, Estás loco. You're crazy. And I went and asked my branch president about this stuff because I figured he would know about it and tell me about it. And I figured this is something they don't teach openly. But now that I came on it on my own, he might tell me about it. And what he said to me was, there's another church out there, a counterfeit church that teaches these things. And I says, really, who are they? So all of a sudden I became interested in who this other church was. And he told me, and then, I laugh about it now, but he told me it was the reorganized church. So I was curious to find out about the reorganized church, but I didn't have a way to do that or investigate it at the time. Well, anyway, my dad was away from home a lot because he was managing a mine, and the mine was about a 2-hour drive from where we lived. So often when he'd go out there, he'd stay there for as long as he had to and then come home occasionally. And when Dad would come home, his routine was he liked to stay in bed all day and read good books. And my mom would even serve him his meals in bed.
Wow.
And because Dad, would just basically be exhausted after working and managing the mine. And so I knocked on his door and he said, "Who is it?" I said, "It's me. It's Sean, Dad. Can I come in and talk with you?" And he said, "Yeah, come on in." So I sat at the foot of the bed. And he says, what do you need? He says, "What do you want?" And I says, "Dad, is it true that they used to teach plural marriage as being a principle we had to live to make it to the highest degree of the celestial kingdom?" He looked at me and he said, "Yes." I says, "Did they also teach that Adam was our father and our God?" And he said, "Yes." He says, "Why are you asking me all these questions?" And I said, I showed him, I had a couple of those pamphlets in my hand. I showed it to him. And he said, "Son, those things are written with a lot of venom. I wouldn't put much faith in those." I said, I know, Dad, I understand that, but they did teach these things, right?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, how do you feel about it?" I said, "Honestly, son, I've always believed those things." And I said, "Really?" He goes, "Yeah." And he says, "Why are you asking me again?" And I told him of the experience I had about reading and being inspired to read the quotes. And he says, "Sit down, and there's a few things I got to tell you." And he said, "Do you remember your Aunt Karen?" That's my dad's sister. And I said, "Yeah, I remember her." When I was 9 years old, we went by to visit them, and they lived in Riverton, Utah. And that was the first time I met a lot of the members of my dad's side of the family. And yeah, I remember Aunt Karen. And he says, well, her last name is Barlow. Does that mean anything to you? And I said, no. I says, what's with Barlow? Says the Barlows are one of the biggest polygamous families in Utah. I said, Aunt Karen's a polygamist? And he says, who do you think that other lady was when we went to go visit them? I says, well, my cousins used to call that other lady Aunt C. So I figured it was Uncle Lyman's sister. And he said, no, that's your Uncle Lyman's second wife.
So at this point, is your dad still inactive as
Yeah.
you're having this conversation with him?
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, anyway, I was kind of in shock. Not only was it true, but it was in my own family, and I didn't know about it. And then he said, my dad used to tell us stories of his stepfather, and my dad used to refer to him as Father George. His name was George Kalmar. And he used to say, Father George used to say this to us. Father George used to do this. My dad was very fond of him. And he says, you remember the stories I told you about Father George? And I said, yeah. He would say, well, one thing I never told you is that he was arrested in 1944.
Oh, I know where this is going.
And I said, why? He says, I said, was he a polygamist? He said, he believed in it, but he never practiced it. Why didn't he practice it if he believed in it? I said. And he said, well, he had multiple sclerosis and he was in a wheelchair. So he had a hard time attracting women.
Can I insert a comment here?
Yeah.
If you have a copy of the sermons of Joseph Musser from 1940 to 45, which I think the Allred Group put out by the help of Ivan Nielsen, and I think it was Nate Taylor that had to do with publishing that, you will actually see references and in the meetings, where Joseph Musser will talk about his step-grandfather, George Kalmar. And,
Wow.
Yeah. And so he was in that, those cottage meetings, those, at that, in the priesthood home meetings at those time and in Salt Lake, in the early, yeah.
Well, anyway, Dad told me he had been arrested. And oh shit, I forgot to bring my inhaler.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Anyway, I have asthma, so I need to hit the inhaler every now and then.
Did I get you? Need some water or anything?
No, I'm fine.
Okay.
But anyway, he said, he was arrested. And I said, well, if he wasn't a polygamist, why did they arrest him? He says they charged him with conspiracy to teach and promulgate the doctrine of plural marriage.
Wow.
Of course, he only lasted in jail about 4 days. And they realized that charge wouldn't hold, so they released him. But the fact that they actually put him in jail for that, a guy in a wheelchair.
That's crazy.
But anyway, so that begins my story with fundamentalism. But up to this time, I didn't know any actual fundamentalists. My dad, you could say, I guess, was a fundamentalist at heart, or he wouldn't have said what he said to me.
Yeah.
But I asked Dad, can you teach me about this stuff? And he says, son, I've always been a reprobate. And I would do a poor job of teaching you anything like this. Says, but if you would like, he says, I'm making a trip next month to the United States. I'm going to go visit my family in Utah. If you would like, I can bring you some books. And I said, I'd love that, Dad. And Dad was true to his word. When he came back, he brought me 3 books. One was Michael, Adam, Our Father and Our God by Joseph Musser. The other one was Celestial Plural Marriage. And I can't remember if one of the other, I might be wrong, but one of them I think was from Ogden Kraut and one was from Joseph Musser, but I can't remember which was which.
Celestial Plural Marriage is Musser.
Celestial Plural Marriage would have been Musser, and the Adam God was It's either Musser or Ogden Kraut.
Michael, our Father and our God, is Musser. Celestial Plural Marriage is also.
Okay, so they were both from Musser. But anyway, Dad brought those books for me, and I just read through them both. And I began to immediately translate excerpts of it into Spanish. And I started sharing them with my friend, David Schellenberg. Well, David Schellenberg took what I wrote home. The next thing I know, he's talking to me out of Bruce R. McConkie.
Oh, no.
Oh.
So Bruce R. McConkie would say this, and I would say, well, Brigham Young said this.
Right.
So we had our little arguments. But anyway, needless to say, I wasn't as zealous in preaching on behalf of the church as I had been before. And I'll tell you that David Schellenberg and I got to the point where during a break in school, we had all our classmates surrounding us under a tree, and we'd be reading out of the Book of Mormon to them. That's how zealous we were about it.
Wow.
But needless to say, when this happened, I began to lose heart, and it started to bug me that the church would repudiate these things that were obviously true to me. And we then moved to the States when I was 14, around the time I turned 14, moved to the States, and I went, I was enrolled in junior high, the second half of my 8th grade year. And at that point, I went inactive, and I didn't really regain activity until after I got married. But I had a couple of moments in between where that were still kind of little highlights in my life, but I want to get through this story a little quicker. I became active in the church right after my first daughter was born. This would have been in 1988. We were again living in Mexico, and I was married about a year, and I took my wife with me down to Mexico, and we were operating another mine, but this one was owned by the family. And to give you an idea, my wife and I lived out of a 2-man tent for a good portion of the year.
Oh.
And because where we lived was out in the middle of nowhere. It was, to give you an idea, it was very mountainous, a lot of canyon country. And to get out there, you'd be on a pretty bad dirt road for 15 hours to get out to where the mine was. So it was pretty remote. And when you went out there, it was basically a different world. You went back in time.
Yeah.
But anyway, I made a trip to the States when my daughter was about to be born, because I wanted my daughter to be born in the United States and not in Mexico. I wanted her to be an automatic U.S. citizen. The wife I married, she was American as well. But anyway, so my daughter was born in Tucson, Arizona. And I had a dream the night before she was born. So it would have been in the early hours of December 8th, 1988. And I had a dream where there was general mayhem in society. People were killing each other, and there was extreme hatred everywhere. And I remember feeling in total despair, because I didn't feel the way a lot of these people felt, and I couldn't understand why is everybody so full of hate and so murderous in their hate. And then I remember in the dream, a bright light appeared in the horizon. And I said to myself, we finally did it. This is World War III. That's a nuclear explosion that just went off. Except there was never a boom. I never heard an explosion or anything. And that light just kept getting brighter and brighter and closer. And when the light got close enough, you could make out the figure of a man in the light. And as it got closer, I realized that the light was emanating from that man. And when he got close enough, the people had been fighting each other turned their weapons onto him. And he looked at him and then just waved his left arm like this. And the earth began to shake. The wind started howling. Fires started breaking out everywhere. And it was like tornadoes. Everything happened all at once. And people were being destroyed left and right. And then I noticed that these pillars of light were descending like this. And I was curious what's going on. And I looked. When I looked at the base of these pillars of light, there was somebody there and they were praying. So in my mind, I understood that these were like pillars of protection.
Okay.
And I realized that I wasn't being destroyed either. And then that vision changed and it flipped, like somebody hitting a slide. The next thing I know, I'm finding myself in a desert terrain. I'm very thirsty, and I'm looking for something to drink somewhere. And it wasn't a sandy desert, but it was more like a bedrock desert or like a sandstone, kind of like in Moab, that area.
Gotcha.
And I noticed this hill, and it was like a bedrock hill. And I noticed like a film of water just wetting a little strip of the rock. So I followed that film to find where the water source was. As I crested the hill, there was an indentation at the top and had a little pond of water with a little spring feeding it. But there was a man there that was drinking the water, and he had a white robe on and was wearing sandals, and he had hair down to about shoulder length or so. And his hair, I would describe it as kind of a honey strawberry blonde mix. And when he feels my presence, he stands up and looks at me. And he didn't say anything to me, but he just looked at me, and his look conveyed. I don't even like to use the word love much, because I think a lot of people have kind of soured me on the term love, because you got to just love this and love that to the point that it becomes a little nauseating to hear. But I can't think of a better word. So what I felt from him was pure love and compassion, and everything rolled up in one, but it was tangible. I could feel it. And then I heard a voice in my mind that said, "Whosoever drinks of this water shall thirst again, but whoso drinks of the water that I shall give him shall have a fountain bursting into everlasting life." I woke up from that and I was crying. I woke my wife up and I told her about the dream. And almost immediately after I told her about the dream, which is the following morning, she went into labor. And so for the rest of the day, it was going to the hospital and taking care of that. And then all of a sudden I was a dad. I had a baby girl, and the thought of that dream just kept in my mind. And I didn't know what else to do. So when I returned to Mexico, I was determined that I'm going to get active in the church again. That's all I knew to do. And so I ended up talking my entire family into becoming active in the church. And I have two brothers and my dad, and we all got ordained priests in the Aaronic priesthood on the same day. And later on, a few months later, we were all ordained elders on the same day again.
Wow.
Something happened that was really interesting to me. When we were ordained priests, they wanted to give my dad the privilege, my dad and my older brother, the privilege of blessing the sacrament. So both my dad and my brother got up there to bless the sacrament, and my dad got on his knees and he raised his right arm to the square like this. And he began to say the prayer. And I remember the bishop asked one of the deacons to come up to him. And then he told him to go tell him not to do what he's doing. And so they tapped my dad on the shoulder and they told him to put his arm down and not to pray that way. And my dad looked really puzzled. not just puzzled, but he looked almost angry that they did that.
Right.
But anyway, that caught my attention. And after the sacrament was over and they came and sat back down on her, Dad sat right next to me on the pew. I said, Dad, what was that you just did? I've never seen that. He says, well, that's how they used to bless the sacrament when I was a little boy. And my dad was born in 1934, and I said, really? And he goes, yeah. And he was kind of pissed off that they stopped him from doing that, because he felt it was a touch embarrassing too.
Sure.
Well, anyway, by the summer of 1989, they organized a temple excursion. We lived in the city of Durango, Mexico. They organized a charter bus, and they made reservations for those who were going to go receive their endowments. We would all travel to Mexico City. So of our family, the ones that went was my mom and dad, my wife and I, and my sister Anna. So we went down and received our endowments at the Mexico City Temple. And we stayed a whole week. They had an apartment complex there for people who were doing that. But they separated the women from the men. And in the rooms, they had bunks, and they would fit several men in there. So there was about 6 of us to a room. And so I went through my own endowment, and I started going to, the first day we just went to the one session, but the following days we were going to several sessions. And you didn't have to do it all, because you could just go to a session, or you could go do some initiatories and whatnot. And at the time I was still kind of squeamish about the initiatories, so I just went to sessions.
Right.
And it was getting a little boring to see the same session over and over, but on the seats that we used to sit in, because it was a movie, they had buttons with different languages you could see the endowment in. So I wanted to hear it in English, and then I wanted to hear it in Italian. And I did a few languages. I did German, French, Italian, English, and Spanish.
Wow.
But anyway, and they put headphones on you that you clipped in, kind of like they do on airplanes,
Right.
And well, anyway, that was an interesting experience, but I remember being somewhat disappointed, because I was hoping to see more of the Adam God in it. And the way the church did it at the time is they would have 2 glorious beings, Elohim and Jehovah, but Michael was just a voice.
Right.
So it gave you the idea that these are 2 resurrected beings, but Michael was a spirit.
Now, conversely, in my experience with the second generation of videos, I seem to recall that they do show Michael as a embodied and with a white robe as well. And so me knowing about the Adam God doctrine before I was endowed, I kind of picked up on a few nuances that I figured were kind of left in there.
Gotcha.
But as he says, they've kind of had an overemphasis on the other way.
And of course, the way they presented it made you think that Jehovah was Jesus, But anyway, so I was disappointed with that part of it. But I do remember hearing little glimpses here and there that, wait a minute, that kind of seems to favor the Adam God doctrine here and there. And this is before they removed all the penalties and stuff. And we still for the second part of the Melchizedek priesthood, you still use the words in the Adamic language rather than just the English version of them. But anyway, our mind went belly up, and I was the first one that had to leave, because I had to go get a job and support my family. So my wife and I, my little girl, we made a trip to the United States. And my sister Anna was already living up there, and she already had an apartment. So we went in with her, and my wife's brother had an apartment, and he said, you can live with me until you get on your feet. So we moved in with him, but I immediately, looked up my local ward, and I put myself on the rolls there. But anyway, not much happened during that time, except at the end of, I lived in Tucson for about a year. Towards the end of the year, actually it was like around September, the rest of my family moved out of Mexico and came back to the States. My mom and dad came by to visit me, and dad said he was going to be making a trip to Utah because he wanted to see his family again. So my mom and dad traveled on to Utah. When he came back, he brought me a copy of George Calmar's journal.
Okay.
And he had so I read the whole thing, but the last entry in his journal is what really, really impressed me.
Can I comment though?
Yeah.
The years, that'd be like 1940 to 44, then a few entries after that point. So it's that time period.
Okay.
When I read, my grandfather had a spiritual manifestation, which he wrote down in his journal. It was the very last entry in his journal. It was remarkable. It starts out by saying, in the early hours of the morning in the first week of March, 1959, I had a manifestation of the Lord's Spirit as plain to me as a conversation between one man and myself. And I'll leave this for another time to give you a little bit something to hang on with, but it made such an impression on me that I decided right then and there I want to move to Utah and I want to investigate the fundamentalists. My calling in the church at the time is I never served a mission for the church. I mean, between the fact that I was inactive when I was single, then I was married, I didn't get a chance to serve a mission. But when I moved to Utah, my dad called my uncle Mark Calmar. It was my dad's half brother, and he was his youngest brother. And my dad was the oldest in the family. Uncle Mark was the youngest, but it would be a misnomer to call him my dad's little brother because my dad's 5'8" and his little brother was 6'4". But anyway, consequently, I'm 5'8", so I'm not very big either. But anyway, that was the first conversation I had with somebody else that had fundamentalist leanings. Uncle Mark was still in the church, and he served a mission for the church. He served a mission in Australia, but I could talk freely with him about my beliefs, and he could talk with me. And he started taking me around to meet other people. So I met Nate Boss Jr. I met Jim Jessup. He took me to go meet my grandmother's brother was Fred Morrison. So he took me to go meet with him. And I started associating with some fundamentalists, but these, as you can see, were more of the Lewis Kelch independent fundamentalists. But very quickly, I became a little disappointed because it seemed like their religion was just made up of racism. They were always saying black this, black that, Jew this, Jew that, and I thought to myself, you guys sound more like you're from the Klan than you do Mormons.
Yeah.
And so I was pretty disappointed because I realized really quick that these guys aren't going to accept me. You know, I'm not white enough, you know. And so I was quickly disappointed with that, and I ended up getting a job with another group of polygamists. I worked for a company called Custom Construction and Design, owned by Daniel Olszewski, and I believe they were Centennial Parkers.
Okay.
Well, anyway, I remember I told you about my Aunt Karen. my cousins were also working there. So I had 3 cousins that were working for this guy, which is kind of how I got the job. And I ran into the same problem with them. I mean, my cousins liked me, but they said an awful lot of racial slurs around me. And so, and I'm not going to repeat what they were here because I don't think that's necessary. But so I felt pretty dejected by that. And I remember I actually got pretty depressed about it. I was still in the church. I was attending the Midvale 11th Ward. And the one calling that seemed to follow me from Mexico all the way to Utah is they always called me to be a Sunday school president. But anyway, so during this time, I just maintained my church activity, but to tell you the truth, I wasn't really, I like meetings every now and then, but I always felt empty. I always felt unfed.
Like something was missing.
Right. But anyway, I started having doubts, and I remember praying almost in anger. I says, "Is this a joke, Father? You give me a testimony of these things. The only people I find that believe these things wouldn't have me be part of their society because I'm of the wrong race." And I just remember feeling kind of angry about it. And then I had a very interesting dream at that time. I dreamt that I was walking in a small town in northern Mexico. And when I started seeing people, they were dressed like around the turn of the century. Guys were wearing those little Herbie, what are they called, those hats?
Derbies?
Derbies, the derby hats. Women had the hair in a bun and they had the collar up to here.
Sure.
And so it looked like around the turn of the century.
Oh, I remember this one.
And so I knocked on the door because I was pretty hungry. And this lady answered the door, and she was American. And I thought it was weird that I knew I was in northern Mexico, but she was an American lady. And she says, "Hello, what can I do for you?" I said, "Ma'am, if it wouldn't be too much to ask, if you would spare a meal, if you have any chores I could do for you, chop wood or anything, I'd be willing to do that." And she says, "Oh, you're most welcome to a meal, but you don't have to do any of that. I've made enough. There's plenty to go around." And he says, "Why don't you take a seat? My husband will be by shortly." Okay. So she went back to tending to the meal that she was cooking. And then the gentleman walked in. And I have to say that they were young, but they had a demeanor about them like they were much older. And the gentleman sat down and they said a prayer over the meal. And he starts asking me a little bit about who I am and everything. And then he begins to teach me about the principle of plural marriage. And he did it in such a way, I wish I could remember, because he explained it to me in such a way as to make it very obvious as to why it's necessary. Not just because the scriptures say so or because a prophet said so, but he gave me a kind of why it's necessary for the
celestial mechanics.
Yeah. I don't, why it was necessary to be part of the celestial law. It was a wonderful explanation. I wish I could remember that. And I instinctively said to him, "Is it as binding upon me and my generation as it is upon you and yours?"
Wow.
And he said to me, "It's an everlasting law." That's how he answered. It's an everlasting law. I think you know the answer to that. And I was getting ready to leave, and then I said, "Sir, I never got your name. With whom have I had the pleasure of conversing?" And he says to me, "My name is Abraham Owen Woodruff, and this is my wife, Helen."
Wow.
Anyway, I woke up and I knew that was a significant name because, Woodruff.
Right.
And so I went to the library and I looked up books on Mormons in Mexico. And I found one, and that was the title, Mormons in Mexico. And I started reading through it, and it talked about when the Mormons first started settling down in the colonies. Then it had pictures here and there of some of the men down, it had a picture of Anthony Ivins. You had Rael Taylor.
Hillman Pratt, probably.
Right.
And,
so a lot of these guys, and then there was a picture there of Abraham Owen Woodruff. And I looked at that picture, and it was the same guy I saw in my dream. So that gave me the hope not to lose heart. And I thought it was interesting that why him, and why was it setting in northern Mexico? I'm only going to speculate as to the reason, but Abraham Owen Woodruff presided in that area, which happened to be the area that included the place where I was born, because I was born in Ciudad Juarez, Chihuahua. And he was the general authority that presided in that region.
Wow. So you felt like maybe he had, even after he had passed, he had some sort of yeah, over that
Right.
still.
and so, do you know much about Owen Woodruff, David?
I've read a little bit. Yeah.
He's quite a fascinating guy. I like to study up on him here and there, but he's interesting in that he obviously appointed an apostle the later years of his father's presidency, entered into plural marriage pretty close to after his father died, 1899 or 1900 or 1900, to a second wife. And after the second manifesto, he went and proposed to a close relative of Senator Reed Smoot. After the second manifesto, unfortunately, he wasn't able to make good on that marriage arrangement because he died later that year, and he was only in his 30s at the time. And so the game could have definitely been different had he lived. But he had a very close relationship with John W. Taylor and Matthias Cowley.
Well, anyway, when in 1991, I met the Jessup family, Ted Jessup and his wife Eva, and of course some of his sons. This is when I first met Moroni Jessup.
Okay.
And when I met them, they were still considered independent, and they had the same issues with the same group of fundamentalists that I did, because, as you know, Moronis also half Mexican.
Right.
And so they kind of had issues that way, like I did. And when I used to work with Uncle Mark here and there. He did landscaping or remodeling. And the job that I had with the Oshevskis kind of ran out. So I was working with Uncle Mark again. And he was contracted to finish a basement for Ted Jessup. But before that happened, Ted Jessup's cousin, a guy by the name of Matthew Jessup, he says to me, you're going to like meeting my cousin Ted. I says, why is that? Well, he married a Mexican lady, and his kids are like you. And they also believe as we do. I said, really? Yeah. So I was kind of excited to meet him. And I went to work with Uncle Mark, and we started working on that basement. And then Ted Jessup got home from work, and he came down to talk with us. And of course, all work stopped, and we just started talking gospel. You know how that goes.
Sure. Yeah. The
So
good stuff.
job, we really milked it. We really milked the job because we start talking gospel and not much work would get done. But anyway, so that was nice. And a few months later, I heard that Matthew Jessup says, well, Ted's gone off and joined the All Red group. I said, really? He goes, yeah, why'd he do that? He goes, I don't know. I guess he needed to follow someone. Because the independents were kind of proud of the fact that they didn't follow anybody.
Right.
Well, anyway, that piqued my interest quite a bit. And as soon as I got home, I called Ted Jessup and I said, I heard that you joined the All Red group. Is that true? And he goes, yes. And I says, why'd you do it? And he says, do you realize you're the first person that asked me that question? Everybody else assumes why I did it. And I said, so the question still stands. Why did you do it? And he said, I would rather tell you in person. So why don't you come to my house on the 23rd, which was a couple days away. On the 23rd, we're having a dinner. And if you'd like, I'd like to invite you and your family to come have dinner with us, and we'll talk about it then. I said, okay. Well, it happened to be December 23rd, Joseph Smith's birthday. So it was December 23rd, 1991. So I went over there, and he had another guest there for dinner, a man by the name of Adán Reynoso, a Mexican guy.
Nice.
And Adán Reynoso was from the colony down in just south of Mexico City. The All Reds have a colony there. And Adán Reynoso had been a fundamentalist his whole life. I never knew you had fundamentalists that deep in Mexico. And he starts telling me stories of how he carried Joseph Musser on his back from, because they didn't have the road totally punched into the colony at the time. And so he carried Joseph Musser on his back.
Wow.
And he bore his testimony to me. And I thought, so this group accepts Mexicans? So I was intrigued and I wanted to know more. And so I asked, is it okay if I come to one of your meetings? And they looked at me like, why are you even asking? Of course you are. It's okay for you to come. And I said, well, I'm asking because I'm kind of used to, when I would ask other people, can I go to a meeting? They change the subject or they'd either change the subject or, well, maybe now's not a good time or something like that. And, but this one, yes, you sure come in. And so I attended my first meeting, and the guy that was talking was Joe Thompson. And he was speaking about the Adam God doctrine. And that was the first time that I had heard that doctrine spoken in such a way. You know the expression that he didn't speak as a scribe, but as one having authority?
Right.
That really came to my mind. And I attended this meeting. They said that, I was told they had priesthood meetings on Wednesdays. So I went to that, went to the next meeting, went to that. I would attend the early meetings. I was told later that I wasn't supposed to attend the priesthood meetings until I was a member, and that was by invitation only. But some people said they didn't have the heart to tell me that. They just let me keep coming. For a good 4 months straight about before I was baptized, or rebaptized in this case.
Right.
And so I was rebaptized in around April of '92. April or May, I can't remember exactly when. And the priesthood was reconferred on me by William Baird, or Bill Baird. And but I had really good conversations with him, and he was one of these guys that was very open to talk to new people. It made you feel right at home. And after talking with him, he called on me to talk. So that was the first time I got up to talk to the congregation up there in Bluffdale. But anyway, that's how I officially became a fundamentalist.
Sean, there's so much of your story that resonates with me, and probably the biggest point that resonates with me is I have 6 kids, and my wife and I had 4, and we ended up adopting a set of twins from my sister. She just kind of left them in the hospital. She was all methed out, but those kids are half Mexican.
Okay.
And when I was studying out fundamentalism, and I was looking for a place where I could go, that was front and center in my mind. I remember I talked to some folks, and I won't say who it was, but Yeah, I mean, I would say, I have these kids, and they're, they're my kids, right? And they're half Hispanic. Are they going to be welcomed? And it wasn't like a true organized group, so to speak, but it was enough that they had some sort of structure there. And it was like, gosh, I don't know if you guys are going to be comfortable here, and you probably shouldn't come. And so I can identify with it, not personally like you could, but looking for a place where my kids would be accepted.
Right.
And I'll never use this podcast as a tool for proselytizing, because I just enjoy talking to people from all branches of fundamentalism. But when I did finally find, our church home now, that was a question I asked not once, not twice, not 3 times, but many times. And each time it was like, no, it's cool. Really, it's cool. And I can only imagine what it must have felt like for you to find that place where you were just welcomed, right? And loved on. And because as I saw my kids welcomed and loved on, it was such a relief. And mixed with the relief of being able to just hear the gospel in its fullness in a place where that your kids are loved and you're loved, speaks volumes. So your story really does resonate with me. Like I said, I didn't experience the things that you experienced, but I worried about it enough with my kids that I can only imagine. I was relieved for my kids. I can't imagine what you must have felt like, and the relief you felt when you finally found that place.
It's, as an understatement, I would like to say, if I judged the religion based on its people, I would have apostatized a long time ago.
And that's true, right? Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And that's the other thing I think is so important. I think you hit on a great point, which is you better make sure that you convert to this, or that your testimony is rooted in truth and not in friendships with people. Because look, we all try to be good folks, but we're mortal, and we're going to stumble, and we're going to let each other down at times. And you better be rooted in that truth and in gospel, so that not only can you withstand that, but you can get over those hurts with other people and still love them in spite of what happened.
Right.
So, dude, that was awesome. That was a great story. Let's transition now into what we wanted to talk about. And it's this subject, the Council of 50, is one of those subjects that really didn't burst onto the Mormon scene again until just a couple years ago, right? When the Joseph Smith papers start filtering out and you start really hearing about it. And it's cloaked almost in this idea, as I listen to anti-Mormon folks talk about it, or even progressive Mormons, they tend to cloak this in this idea of, oh, this was just Joseph trying to get more power and whatnot. And I think as we peel the layers back on this a little bit through this discussion, we're going to find that that's not the case. So let me ask you this question. What was the Council of 50?
Well, I've heard about it before. I read the Joseph Smith Journal in the same year, 1991. A good friend of mine, he was married to my cousin Diane Barlow, and his name is Alan Nielsen. He was the son of Ivan Nielsen. And for Christmas, he gave me a book called The Diaries and Journals of Joseph Smith, an American Prophet's Record. I don't know if you've heard of that book.
I haven't.
But it was basically just verbatim. They didn't bother to correct spelling or anything. They would just, in parentheses, would write little corrections here and there. But anyway, I read the Joseph Smith diaries, and that's when I first became acquainted with the concept of the Council of 50. And a lot of times they would write the word 50 backwards. Like, it
was a code word.
How does it?
Oh, yeah, YTTIF.
Yeah, they would write it backwards a lot of times in the journal.
Yeah.
I also read and was highly intrigued by the second anointing, especially because of the importance that Joseph Smith put to it. Like in September 28th, 1843, Joseph Smith made the statement that him and it actually said Baruch Ale
Right.
was anointed a king and a priest along with his wife to the highest order of the priesthood of God on earth, something to that effect. So I paid attention to stuff like that. This is the highest order, and it was all tied in with the Holy Order of Nauvoo and the concept of the Council of 50. Now in the All Red group, what they used to teach us about the Council of 50 was,
Hold on, thought.
He's got to plug in, his battery's going low.
No.
But anyway, that was my introduction to it, and they used to teach it that it was the political arm of the priesthood, and that it was to establish a civil government that would protect every religion within its jurisdiction. And they would say that it was made up of 48 high priest apostles and 2 honorable men of the world. Well, I didn't question that for a long time, other than it never made sense to me. Like, why would people of the world ever give their consent to be governed by 48 Mormons and only have 2 to represent everybody else? It just seemed, knowing human nature, that just seemed to me like, that'll never fly. I have kind of a critical way of thinking. And, but anyways, several years later, I came into this book here. It was written by Hiram Andrus. And let's see, it's the copyright on it is.
Real quick, because there's a lot of people that won't see the video, but it says Joseph Smith and World Government is the name of the book.
Right. And it was written by Hiram L. Andrus. I don't see the copyright.
It's gonna be on this page here, probably.
Okay. Well, the new copyright's 1972, so obviously there's an older one. But so I read it, and I became aware that the Council of 50 wasn't strictly made up of 50 people. They called it a Council of 50 because they roughly had 50 members. Sometimes it was 48, sometimes it was 52. Another thing I found out is that it wasn't limited to 2 honorable men of the world.
Right.
They had quite a few. And one of the things that struck me about this is about its organization. This is a statement made by Brigham Young. He said, "A man may be a legislator in that body which will issue laws to sustain the inhabitants of the earth in their individual rights and still not belong to the Church of Jesus Christ at all. And further, though a man may not even believe in any religion, it would be perfectly right, when necessary, to give him the privilege of holding a seat among that body which will make laws to govern all the nations of the earth and control those who make no profession of religion at all. For that body would be governed, controlled, and dictated to acknowledge others in those rights which they wish to enjoy themselves."
I think,
So,
sorry.
go ahead.
I was going to say, I think, and I'm glad you hit on that, because that's where I wanted to go. The people who say, well, this was just another invention by Joseph Smith to exercise even more authority than he had. If that was the case, why invite non-Mormons onto that council?
Right.
It
Sharing that authority.
Absolutely. It was, you can see the prophet really does care, not just about his people, but about all people. He cared about their rights, and he had said so on many occasions. And this is one of the few instances that you can actually see not him just talking about it, but he puts it into practice. He acts upon his beliefs. He says, no, come to this council, help us establish a better way. And I think we need to understand the council is coming out of a time when the Mormons have really been kind of shafted by the federal government in a lot of ways, right?
Right.
Their rights were not protected under the divine constitution that was given. And so Joseph sees that, hey, maybe we need to do something different here, not trash the Constitution necessarily, but form a body in which everybody's rights and everybody's right to practice their religion is protected.
Right.
I have a comment.
Go ahead.
At the time that Joseph Smith was organizing the Council of 50 and this Kingdom of God in a civil capacity idea, it either came on the heels of his own bid for the presidential election or vice versa. I don't recall which happened first. But as you're saying, all of that together was a complete result of them being ignored of their civil rights and freedoms in the Missouri troubles. And you can find it in the William Clayton or Willard Richards Journal or Woodruff's Journal even, that the Joseph's comments on this were, that this is to get the attention. My platform as the presidential candidate is to basically get us in the public eye so that we can have our reparations, and have our rights addressed, but it's this also kind of, I think, shocked a lot of people, and it was a severe threat though too, because the missionary program of the church, was this, the missionaries in the church were sent out without person script. So you have all the missionaries of the church, out there on their missions, basically campaigning for Joseph Smith's presidency for free. Where all the other candidates, had to have a budget or funds appropriated by the parties at the time, and so he had far more exposure per capita or ratio wise, to the public at that point during, which I find interesting when you see the political troubles that came, as a result of it. You can't beat that. That kind of power.
No. So we dispelled one myth right there off the bat, that this is not an attempt at Joseph at just grabbing authority, right?
Right.
This is something that he's talked about before. I can't remember the exact wording of the sermon, but he says, look, I'm ready to lay down my life, not just for my people, but for a Baptist or a Methodist or a Presbyterian. He was concerned because I think he felt it very personally in what happened in Missouri. He was like, this is a bigger problem.
And in the King Follett discourse, he alludes to some of that stuff too, where he says every man has a constitutional right basically to be a false prophet. And he used himself as an example. They call me a false prophet. I have every right to be a false prophet as much as everyone else. And if we didn't have that right and we just go kill all the false prophets, then the whole world would be deluged in blood,
Right.
But here they are, they're just after me.
Yeah. And I think Sean, you were right too, that I think people are conflating the second anointing with the Council of 50, right? And I think that's where that misconception of, being pronounced king of the world, so to speak, comes in. Is they're not understanding that even though it's the same journal entry, they're not
Right.
talking about the same event.
Well, which kind of brings me to my next point. Now, from the things that I knew of the teachings of Joseph Smith in regards to government and how he spoke that the Constitution was an inspired document, with that in mind, one of the interesting things here is let me turn here to a statement made by Brigham Young. Let me see what. Brigham Young stated in regards to the the U.S. Constitution, he said, "But few, if any, understand what a theocratic government is. In every sense of the word, it is a republican government. It differs but little in form from our national, state, and territorial governments, but its subjects will recognize the will and dictation of the Almighty. The Constitution and laws of the United States resemble a theocracy more closely than any government now on earth. Even now, the form of the government of the United States differs but little from the kingdom of God."
Here,
Yeah.
this is from the same sermon right there, but they cut a little bit out of it.
He goes on to say,
Start with the bolt there.
the kingdom of God circumscribes and comprehends the municipal laws for the people and their outward government, to which pertain the gospel covenants by which the people can be saved, and those covenants pertain to fellowship and faithfulness. The gospel covenants are for those who believe and obey. Municipal laws are for both saint and sinner. The Constitution and laws of the United States, okay, I already read that part. But so right off the bat, he's telling us that the constitutional government of the United States closely resembles what they knew and understood of the kingdom of God. And also, and this is really important, John Taylor, in speaking about it, John Taylor explained, "The proper mode of government is this: God first speaks, and then the people have their action. It is for them to say whether they will have his dictation or not. They are free. They are independent under God. The government of God is not a species of priestcraft, where one man dictates and everybody obeys without having a voice in it. We have our voice and agency and act with the most perfect freedom. Still, we believe there is a correct order, some wisdom and knowledge somewhere that is superior to ours. That wisdom and knowledge proceeds from God through the medium of the holy priesthood. We believe that no man or set of men of their own wisdom and by their own talents are capable of governing the human family aright. These are our opinions. We believe that it requires the same wisdom that governs the planetary system, that produces seed, time, and harvest, day and night, that organized our system, and that implanted intelligence in finite man. That it needs the same intelligence to govern men and promote their happiness upon the earth that it does to control and keep in order the heavenly bodies. And we believe that that can not be found with man independently."
Yeah, and I want to, a couple things have come to mind here. One is Brigham Young. When him and the Saints first get to the Salt Lake Valley, their very first parade they actually make sure that there's a copy of the Constitution of the United States that is in that parade, right? Brigham still feels very strongly that that's an inspired document.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing I'll say is that I was visiting Brigham Young's summer home down in St. George. And I lived out on the East Coast for a while because I'm a huge nerd when it comes to the founding period of America. I mean, uber nerd. Like, my kids glaze over at the very moment I say Washington. They just like, oh, here he goes. Here goes the old man again. Anyway, as I was going through his home there in St. George, I noticed that there was a picture of Washington that he had in his bedroom, of all places. And I asked, not his bedroom, I think it was his study. Don't quote me on that, but it was someplace where it was kind of Brigham's area, right? And I asked it was a elderly missionary couple that was given the tour, and I asked her about it. And she said that there were actually journal entries where he expresses his admiration for the founding fathers. What you say about the Constitution not being all that much different than as Brigham put it, a perfect theocracy, the American Republican form of government,
Right.
can actually be seen in an interesting exchange between Jefferson and Adams. So they were really good friends for a long time, and then they ended up splitting apart. And then they, towards the end of their lives, they kind of came back together and became friends. And Adams always seems to be kind of a pessimist. And he actually writes a letter to Jefferson once, expressing that he felt like they didn't do the Constitution justice. And in the way that might surprise a lot of people, he tells Jefferson essentially, we didn't put enough Deuteronomy in the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
And Jefferson says, it's okay. Someday people are going to see what we were trying to do and they will fix it. Right. They'll make it better. So this idea that we have today of separation of church and state, the founders had a different look at it, right? Which was, we're trying to protect religion from the state.
Right.
And now we flip that where we say, well, we have to protect government from religion. The founders' concern was the exact opposite.
Right.
Because they came out of a system where the government and the church were exactly the same. And so when I read about the Council of 50 and I talk with you about it, what I see is an outgrowth of that, right? I can see that perhaps this was that generation who was like, it just needs a little bit more perfecting.
Right.
And so I don't think that, because a lot of people look at the Council of 50 as being at odds with the United States Constitution, and that's not the case.
Right, that's correct. Now, in this part of the discussion, I'm gonna go into some personal speculation. And like I mentioned earlier, that I can't see, because one of the things they taught about the millennial reign is that not everybody at once would be converted to Mormonism, but that we would live amongst other faiths, people of other faiths, and that the role of the kingdom of God was mainly to protect people and their rights. And it's really interesting that they don't mention much about administerial government, that it's constantly protecting the people and their rights. That's the main theme they keep bringing up. Back around 2004 or 5, whenever it was, I remember reading Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code. Well, it's interesting. I took an interest because I saw a lot of things that he wrote in that novel that rang true to me as far as a Mormon's concerned, it's like temple symbolisms and stuff like that. And I remember receiving explanations of the temple symbolism from men like William Barrett and Joe Thompson. And Dan Brown is echoing what they said. But Dan Brown was getting it from secret societies. So I became very interested. And of course, the theme of Dan Brown's novel was that Jesus was married and he had posterity. So I became very interested. Where's he getting his information? So I researched that, and he got most of his information from 2 books, Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and the other one was The Bloodline of the Holy Grail, written by Lawrence Gardner. I actually brought that book with me. And my initial interest in reading this book, The Bloodline of the Holy Grail by Lawrence Gardner, can you see that?
Yep.
It had to do more with symbolism. But as I began to read this book, the focus was that these orders that existed throughout the medieval times into the Renaissance and into the modern age, that everything had to do with a brotherhood that was to maintain correct principles of government. So it should come as no surprise that a good portion of our founding fathers, signers of the Constitution and of the Declaration of Independence, were Masons. And so this book gets into a history of these orders. And it starts out talking about Adam, from whence the origins of the bloodline. And it goes all the way back to talking about Adam and the patriarchs. Then it gets into and talks about Moses, goes on to talk about King Solomon and the Solomon's temple. And it goes through history. It talks about the Christ, and then it talks about the early medieval times, the Merovingian dynasty in France. And I started seeing an awful lot of things that just jump at you if you're a Mormon. As an example, the Merovingian dynasty, who claimed a descendancy from Jesus Christ, they were known as the Fisher Kings. And in this book, he says that Fisher Kings was code for priest kings. Now, as a Mormon, that should jump out at you.
Right.
King and priest, that they were known as the priest kings. They also mentions that they were peculiar in several ways. They were known to have healing powers. They were polygamists, and for some odd reason, the Catholic Church allowed them to be. And their symbol was the honeybee. Childeric's tomb was found, in his robe had a bunch of golden little honeybees on it. That was the symbol of that dynasty. And then you move into the future, and then you have a king of southern France by the name of Godefroy de Bouillon, or known as Godfrey of Bouillon. And he was the first one to launch a crusade into the Holy Land. And it was in the very late thousands. And in the year 1099, he caused two groups to be organized. One was the Knights Templar, and the other was the Priory of Zion. Now, the Knights Templars, the thing that's interesting to me is they had 3 oaths that they had to enter into as part of their initiation. And it was the oath of obedience, the oath of chastity, and the oath of poverty. Now, the oath of poverty is interesting because it was defined as declaring that you own nothing, but everything is God's. Sound familiar?
For us, it should sound really familiar. Yeah.
Right. And also, one of the things that I found of interest is the original Templar cross is very interesting to me. You see that cross?
Yep. I see what you're talking about.
Do you see what I see in it?
Yep.
It's a combination of squares and compasses.
Yep.
But anyway, the first Grand Master of the Knights Templars was a man by the name of Hugues de Payens. And the standard that he would write with was a beehive.
Wow.
That was the symbol that he would write with. And this is all in this book. This guy, by the way, I have to say, appears to be agnostic.
Okay.
Lawrence Gardner. He doesn't seem to be religious in any way, but he's just giving you the information that he was aware of. But anyway, so I figured this can't be coincidence. There's just too much. Another thing I learned that is when he talks about it in the days of Jesus, that they had an initiation at marriage that they referred to as the first anointing. And that's when they were betrothed. And then when they were formally married, received a second anointing.
Wow. So you can almost see that at this point, there's still some types and shadows there, right? It seems like maybe it's veered off a little bit, but you can see where because of what we know now in the restored gospel, you could see that it started in that trunk. If you were to think of it as,
right.
Okay, I'm going to nerd out here. As a surveyor, right? We're all about angles, right? If you go 1 degree off course, it doesn't matter in probably 100 feet, right? You're not going to see it. But when you get out a mile, you're going to be off considerably, right?
Right.
And so what I'm seeing here as you're describing this is that over time, they maybe had an error of 1 degree, but if you prorate that out to 1,000 years, it's off quite a bit, but you can still trace it back to its original origin point. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. Well, anyway, but as I was reading this book, it seemed like the whole thing about the Holy Grail, of course, the Holy Grail, it claims it's a mistranslation of the French Saint Graal, because it's where you break the word. They say Saint means holy. Graal is grail. But if you say Sangre Real, it means holy blood. So when you say the holy grail of Christ, you could actually translate it to the holy blood of Christ. And the cup or the vessel was also symbolic of a woman,
right,
that contained the blood of Christ. And this has reference to his progeny. And so the mission of the Priory of Zion was to protect the descendants and the family of Christ. As a matter of fact, in genealogic terms, they have a term they call desposny, or they say that family is desposnik. Desposny comes from the Greek meaning the master's family. So if you get into genealogy and you find out that you come from a desposnik line, the claim is that you descend from Jesus.
Wow. That's amazing.
So to tie it back into the kingdom of God and the system of government, if you can bear with me, I'd like to read, it's basically 3 pages.
No, please
Actually,
do.
2 pages in a paragraph.
Yeah, please do.
And I have to point out, this guy has nothing to do with Mormonism, but listen to it. And then I'm going to make some commentary after I finish reading it. It's called Precept of the Sangreal. Since those days, many other radical events have taken place: the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, 2 major world wars, and a host of changes as countries have swapped one style of government for another. Meanwhile, civil and international disputes continue just as they did in the Middle Ages. They are motivated by trade, politics, religion, and whatever other banners are flown to justify the constant struggle for territorial and economic control. The Holy Roman Empire has disappeared. The German Reichs have failed, and the British Empire has collapsed. The Russian Empire fell to communism, which has itself been disgraced and crumbled to ruin. While capitalism teeters on the very brink of acceptability, with the Cold War now ended, America faces a new threat to her superpower status from the Pacific countries. In the meantime, nations of Europe band together in what was once a seemingly well-conceived economic community, but which is already suffering from the same pressures of individual custom and national sovereignty that beset the Holy Roman Empire. Whether nations are governed by military-style regimes or elected parliaments, by autocrats or democrats, or whether formally described as monarchist, socialist, or republican, the net product is always the same. The few control the fate of the many. In institutions of dictatorship, this is a natural experience, but it should not be the case in a democratic institution based on the principle of majority vote. True democracy is government by the people for the people in direct or representative form, ignoring class distinctions and tolerating minority views. The American Constitution sets out an ideal for this form of democracy. But in line with other nations, there is always a large sector of the community that is not represented by the party in power. Because presidents and prime ministers are politically tied, and because political parties take their respective turns at individual helms, the inevitable result is a lack of continuity for the nations concerned. This is not necessarily a bad thing, but there is no reliable, ongoing institution to champion the civil rights and liberties of people in such conditions of ever-changing leadership. Britain does at least retain a monarchy, but it is a politically constrained monarchy, and as such is ineffectual in performing its role as guardian of the realm. The United States, unlike Britain, has a written constitution, but has no one with the power to uphold its principles against successive governments who determinedly pursue their own politically vested interests. Is there any answer to the anomaly? An answer that could bring not just a ray of hope, but a shining light for the future? There certainly is, but its energy relies on those in governmental service appreciating their roles as representatives of society rather than presuming to stand at the head of society. Alongside the political administration, this is where it gets interesting. Alongside the political administration, an appointed constitutional champion could be empowered to keep check on any potential disparities and infringements of the Constitution that might occur. This can be achieved in the manner first envisaged by George Washington and the American fathers. It's kind of getting to what you're talking about. Their original plan was for a democratic parliament combined with a working constitutional monarchy, bound not to parliament or the church, but to the people and their written constitution. In such an environment, sovereignty would ultimately rest with the people, while the monarch, as an operative guardian of the realm, would pledge an oath of fealty to the nation, not the reverse as in Britain's case, whereby the nation pays homage to the sovereignty of parliament and the monarchy. In other words, the kingdom is reversed. They swear allegiance to the people. The unfulfilled ambition of the American fathers was that government ministers should be elected by the majority vote of the people, but that their actions be directed within the boundaries of the Constitution. Because that Constitution belongs to the people, its champion, as George Washington perceived, should be a monarch whose obligation is not to politics or religion, but to the sovereign nation. Through the natural system of heredity, being born and bred to the task, such a constitutional guardian would provide an ongoing continuity of public representation through successive governments. In this regard, both monarchs and ministers would be servants of the Constitution on behalf of the community of the realm. Such a concept of moral government lies at the very heart of the Grail Code, and it remains within the bounds of possibility for every civilized nation state. A British Prime Minister recently claimed that it was not his job to be popular. Not so. A popular minister is a trusted minister, and holding a deserved electoral trust facilitates the democratic process. No minister can honestly expound an ideal of equality in society when that minister is deemed to possess some form of prior lordship over society. Class structure is always decided from above, never from below. It is therefore for those of self-made pedestals to be seen to kick them aside in the interests of harmony and unity. Jesus was not the least humbled when he washed his apostles' feet at the Last Supper. He was raised to the realm of a true Grail king, the realm of equality and princely service. This is the eternal precept of the Sangreal, and it is expressed in Grail lore with the utmost clarity. Only by asking, whom does the Grail serve, will the wound of the Fisher King be healed and the wasteland return to fertility. Now, this is promoting a king as a constitutional champion. The thing that I see that wouldn't work with the way this guy suggested it is he's limited to one king. The kingdom of God that Joseph Smith preached was a council of kings with a presiding king. And if you think that their sole role is to just keep government in check, to uphold the rights. If you don't believe in God, the natural rights of people, and if you believe in God, the God-given rights of people, and that is their entire duty, then I can see this idea would sell.
No, I'll be honest. At first, you had me a little worried when you started talking about heredity kings. I'm like,
right,
that always goes off the rails, because you even see it in business, right?
right.
Very rarely do you have by the time it gets to the grandson, they've always ran their father's business into the ground, right? And so you had me nervous for a second, but after you clarified that, I could see that, right? If you had this council of kings, so to speak, right, which is what Joseph had kind of intended with the Council of 50, it's going to naturally rotate through as well, right? And you're not going to have that heredity, and you're not going to have that. And I think it's also important to realize that when Joseph talks about a king, he's not talking about king as Europe understood them, right?
Right, not a dictator.
Right. This is very much servant leadership. Right. And which is really what the founders thought, right? That's why the founders didn't put in term limits, because if you read their notes, there's like, nobody's going to want to serve in government forever. That's just silly and stupid. Right. And so, you would get that natural filter through where you wouldn't have the heredity. So I could see where that could work. Right. And so, and again, it's kind of conjuncture, because, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think we have a lot of documentation on what Joseph saw down the line this would look like. I mean, it's a very plausible theory. I mean, I have a hard time poking holes in it, but yeah, no, I could definitely see that. What were you going to say, Michael?
I was going to say the cool thing about the Council of 50 and merging that with this idea is it incorporates the fraternity aspect into that kingship, right? And so if it's just one family, you see manifest problems with heredity. But if with the Knights Templar, as you were saying, the Grail Code, in with Freemasonry as well, you have that this huge emphasis on fraternity and servantship, right? And priesthood, in the church, even, or just according to the law of God, is naturally to go out and serve, right? And so if you combine that, this Council of 50 with 50 plus, kings, who are sovereign over their houses, but that they come together in council, and there's that bond of fraternity, that's a very powerful safeguard, I believe. And then the champion or president, is elected amongst from that body and their sons perpetually, and it wouldn't necessarily be one family, but it would be within that body. Someone pointed out to me, I wish I had sources, but I don't. Thomas Jefferson, if I'm recalling from memory, said that he envisioned America would be a sovereign nation of what he called yeoman farmers.
Yep.
A yeoman, the definition, one definition is a man holding and cultivating a small landed estate, a freeholder. So one, he owns property and is sovereign over it. So America was supposed to be a nation of people who were independent landholders, and had that stewardship over over what they owned. The second definition is a servant in a royal or noble household, ranking between a sergeant and a groom. And so that's very interesting too, being a servant in a royal household. And when you consider, that we're the children of God, at least from a religious perspective, that's very interesting that's how Thomas Jefferson envisioned that sovereignty being, being designed.
Yeah. No, and again, people get squeamish at the thought of a king, but it's not a king as in terms of the European style, right?
Mhm.
Or the European flavor, if you will. It's more of a priesthood office.
It is, and it's recognizing that the king or council of kings recognizes that everyone else is also a king over their own house, and that with the Constitution, you cannot, as the king being appointed over the council, I have no right to go into another man's freehold or kingdom and go and dictate to them or take away their rights.
Right. Yeah.
I just wanted to.
Oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to make a little rhetorical remark here. Christ is known as the King of Kings.
Mm-hmm.
The way most people understand that is excuse my terminology, but he's such a badass that other kings grovel at his feet. But my understanding after reading what I've read is that he's a king of kings and not a king of slaves.
That's a great point. That is absolutely a great point. And that's just it, is that everything I read about the Council of 50, which isn't a lot because let's face it, there's not a ton out there anymore. There's a lot of books with conjecture or whatever. But reading the notes, or I shouldn't say the notes, but like reading things like from the Joseph Smith papers about it, this wasn't about we're going to hoard this power. This was about making sure that people were protected so they could fill their potential.
Mm-hmm.
And using kind of a priesthood office for that is the best way to do it. Now, I don't know how much priesthood would be involved with someone who wasn't a Mormon, but there's very much a sense of servant leadership that just drips from the pages of the stuff that we do have.
Right. Well, you know, if we look at the Solomon's temple as a model of the kingdom of God a little bit, you have to remember that it had the court of the Gentiles, the court of Israel, and then you had the Holy of Holies. I think that's representative of this structure somehow.
Yeah.
And I don't expect that. I don't expect that non-believers will be ordained priests. You know, but I do see them. I see the possibility of being anointed kings, because the difference between a king and a priest is, if you look at a tree as an analogy, you could say that the root of the tree would be the kingdom or the political entity. Then you have the body or the people represented in the trunk. And then you have the branches and the leaves. And I would see that the leaves are the priesthood or the religious characteristic of this tree, because it receives the light from heaven. So it receives the energy and light from heaven, and the roots receive their power and nutrient from the earth. So I see that as you have to establish a political kingdom wherein the body of Christ or the body of God can flourish. But this body can't flourish unless it also has that guidance from up above.
Right.
Which goes back to first, as you're saying, that the first God speaks, so then the people have
to say. Yes. Now, one of the reasons I've always been interested in this, remember how we talked about how I would kind of tie this into how United Order isn't socialism or communism?
Right.
To me, I can't really speak of one without speaking of the other, because communism and socialism is a total dismissal of the principles that we've been discussing.
Yep. It goes against the yeoman farmer idea.
Right.
You know, of owning a freehold.
So, in turning the pages, as it were, on the subject, I can understand why people get confused, because in the Doctrine and Covenants, it does say from each according to their ability, to each according to their need, which is actually found in the Communist Manifesto. So a lot of people say, well, see, that proves it's communism. It doesn't prove that at all. It's just a concept I mean, we do that all the time in a family unit.
Sure.
You know, the parent from each according to their ability, and to the children to each according to their need. So it's not a revolutionary idea, so to speak. Now, I'm passionate about free enterprise, mainly because when we first moved to Mexico when I was 10 years old, and the first town that we moved to was a town by the name of Ruiz, Nayarit. In this town, there was an entrenched communist element that was very strong. As a matter of fact, anywhere you went in this town, you would see their banners, or you would see their posters glued on walls. And it was usually the PCM, the PPS, or the PTM. What that stands for in Spanish is PCM, es Partido Comunista Mexicano.
Communist Party in Mexico.
Yeah, or Mexican Communist Party. PPS es Partido Popular Socialista. And PTM is Partido de los Trabajadores Mexicanos. Mexican Workers Party.
Yeah.
But they were all socialists. They were all communists in their views. And you would see posters of Che Guevara, Fidel Castro, Mao Zedong, Ho Chi Minh, Joseph Stalin, Lenin. And
just the good guys.
Yeah, they treated them like heroes. And everything that you saw about Americans was American imperialists. And they always, the propaganda is that we were evil exploiters of the poor, of the world, of the workers of the world. And it was really bad, to the point that our house was, almost on a daily basis, people would throw rocks at our house and say, "Gringos, get out." It got bad enough that we had to move out of there because Dad started receiving kidnap and death threats. And so we grew up with that environment. And when I was in 6th grade, I was still in this town, and our teacher was openly teaching us about communism being a favored form of government. And he would show us pictures of Moscow. He would show us pictures of Moscow, and the air looked clean. They had parks. Then he would show a picture of New York and LA, and it shows all the smog. And they were saying that, I was thinking, but the United States is a lot better than you guys are represented here. And he says, that's only because you guys are taking from all of us other countries.
Wow.
You're exploiting us. And so you're benefiting from that. There's some truth to that, by the way, but I don't think the remedy that they're prescribing is the right course.
No.
Well, I bought a book, and it was written in comic book form. And I don't remember what the title of the book was, but I do remember that the author's last name was Diaz. It was in Spanish. And it was showing the fallacy of socialism and communism. And he was writing it very much in favor of free enterprise capitalism. And I read that book through and through. And Mexico at that time was pretty socialist. You could ask any business guy down there what it was like to try to do business. Of course, Dad was running a mine. And if he wanted equipment in Mexico, he couldn't buy it in Mexico unless it was exorbitantly expensive. And to bring it in from the United States, the obstacles to bring it in were so high that he would buy some equipment and it would sit at the border for 1.5 years. Jeez. Before they allowed it to cross. And so you wonder, no wonder Mexico is a poor country. Nobody can develop it because they have to go through all this red tape. My dad used to have a statement where he used to say TMPPO anytime he ran into anything like that. And what that means is typical Mexican piss poor operation. But anyway, so at a very early age, I became pretty articulate in defending the principle of the free market. So when I began to read about the United Order and stuff, and the way people, including a lot of Mormons, including fundamentalists, they taught it like a form of socialism. That always rubbed me wrong.
We're seeing a resurgence of that today, Sean. You can jump on Twitter, and I try to keep my finger on the pulse of all things Mormon, right? I am just down the road from BYU. I'm less than probably 5 miles away. And you have a lot of kids coming out now with this idea, and they are true believers that the United Order is simply a religious version of socialism. And I'm like, that's not it at all. You guys got fed a bad bill of goods, right? And
right.
Once you understand it, you get that. But it's hard to break through on that now, and that's why I feel it's so important, because I honestly worry about the LDS Church, right? I think, and I'm going to say something that may sound kind of controversial here to fundamentalists a little bit, but I think the world's a better place with the church in it, right? Is there a lot wrong with it? It certainly is. But they at least cast a wide net to get people into Mormonism. Right. And if it goes dark, so to speak, and it starts espousing socialist principles based off of a misconception of the United Order, it could have some serious problems, and there will be spillover effect into fundamentalist circles.
No, absolutely. As a matter of fact, I'd like to say that one of the reasons a lot of United Orders have failed is because they did adopt socialist and communist principles. This was even happening even in the old days, because John Taylor complained about it. John Taylor never joined an order. And he was critical, saying that you'll find that the beneficiaries of those orders tend to be the people in charge.
Right.
And he says they tend to live in nice houses while the others live in squalor. And he says this is not the United Order of Enoch.
And you see that in the groups too.
And so I decided to study the issue. A lot of times my study involves, I get these hunches and I look into those hunches, which is what I did with this book earlier about the political structure of the kingdom of God. So I revisited a lot of the scriptures about United Order, but first of all, I want to start out by, a lot of people don't even know the definition of what socialism, communism, or capitalism is. You have to look at the word capital. The definition of the word capital is the means of production. So in that sense, everyone's a capitalist, including the socialists and the communists, because they all deal with the means of production. So what is it that's meant by capitalism? Well, basically capitalism is that the means of production are owned and controlled privately. And socialism is that the means of production are either owned or controlled by the state. And communism is just basically socialism taken to its logical extreme.
Right.
The difference being is that communism, or what they call full communism, is supposed to be anarchy. That when the people are sufficiently socialized, you can do away with class and you can do away with the state. But the way they view things, I don't see that ever happening, because there's always a new generation that needs to be socialized. And communism resorts to violent overthrow and introducing a reign of terror.
That's right. It thrives. It has to live in violence. There's no way it can be. And if you go back clear to Marx, he writes a book. It might be Das Kapital, I'm not sure, but he basically makes the statement. No, it was a letter to his wife. Excuse me, where he says, "I will tear down the old system through blood and revolution, and I will stride like a god through the wreckage as I build something else." So, communism thrives on revolution. So this idea that you're going to get to this utopia is nonsense, because if it doesn't have an oppressor class to fight against, there's nothing it can do.
Right.
I have a comment on that historically. My father served a mission for the church in Taiwan. And so he's when he was in his 20s, he learned how to speak Chinese, and he's been tied over there because he speaks the language. He's lived over there. I've lived over there in China. And when he went to West Point after his mission, he got along very swimmingly with a professor there. He took a Mandarin class there after having already, knowing the language. He was more advanced than the other students, and he developed a really good relationship with the professor. And the professor would tell him the things that happened in China, because he was a native, from mainland China, who grew up during the Cultural Revolution. And I don't know if you know any of the historical context of that time period in China, which was called the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward, where after the communists took over from the nationalists after World War II, you had a whole generation pass, essentially, as they built up a new communist infrastructure. The Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution was essentially a movement sponsored by Mao and the Communist Party elite, where they targeted the students and the upcoming generation. And they basically said, look, kids, your parents and your teachers and those who have been teaching you aren't actually converted enough to the principles of communism. And they encouraged a violent overthrow. And so you had student revolutions, students killing teachers, and all the, that first generation that had helped Mao take over China was now the enemy. And so then they did away with all the people pretty much who would remember what China was like before the revolution. And now you had that, like you said, or what Sean said, you always have new people, a new generation that needs to be socialized. And that's exactly the tactic that they took, and they capitalized on that, took advantage of it, and turned the younger generation against the older generation to solidify and re-entrench those principles of socialism.
And another thing that I'd like to talk about is, it's not just in Mormon circles, but I don't know if you've ever watched any of the Michael Moore's documentaries, like Capitalism, A Love Affair.
I only watch those when I feel like I've really screwed up and I need to punish myself. And rather than hit myself in the crotch with a hammer, I'm like, Michael Moore, I'll just watch one of his movies. So.
Well, anyway, in that one, he actually interviews some religious leaders like Catholic priests and whatnot, and they're saying that capitalism is a sin, and that Jesus taught socialism and all this other stuff. And of course, they come up with the various scriptures where it said that there was no poor among them, they had all things in common. Mm-hmm. And it talks about how everybody was giving to the poor. Well, the point I want to make is, if you truly have a socialist society, how can anybody give anything?
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
So you got to have something to give it. In a socialist society, the state owns everything. So that you don't have the opportunity to give, they just take.
Yep.
And so right on its face, you can't do the prime directive of Jesus of give to the needy.
Right.
In a communist society.
It's a counterfeit of charity, and Christ taught charity, but you can't have charity under compulsion. And you see that with Satan in the war in heaven. this plan that was proposed seemed like a very charitable idea, right? I can serve, or rather, I can offer my services, not myself. I'm not going to offer myself, but I can offer my services and save everyone. Everyone will have the same reward, but it was by force.
Right. I've often said I feel charitable and I feel good every time I give, my tithing, right? But April 15th, I feel violated.
Yes.
And that's the difference, right? Is that one is given freely. Last time I checked, there's nowhere in scripture where Jesus said, yeah, rather than give to the poor, go ahead and give it to Caesar and then let Caesar just deal it out anywhere he wants, right? He said, render to Caesar what is Caesar's. But when it comes to charity, there's not necessarily, give it to the government and let them do it, right? He's admonishing people from their heart. Jesus, despite the fact he is seeking maybe not at his first coming, but it'll end with a political kingdom. That only works in Jesus's thought process if your heart's in it, right? Mm-hmm. Compulsion's not going to get the job done.
No. So getting back to the United Order, in the United Order, a lot of people equate United Order with consecration. And I say, no, it's not the same thing. Consecration is the covenant you enter into. United Order is a system that was made to facilitate you being able to work with others in the quest of honoring that covenant. But you can literally live consecration without being in an order. It's just not as easy to do it. And because you can be consecrated and everything you do, you give to God. You can. Now the covenant, if we recall, states that you consecrate everything that the Lord has blessed you with, your time and talents and everything that the Lord will yet bless you with, to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints for the building up of the kingdom of God and the establishment of Zion. Now, there's a purpose there for the building up of the kingdom of God and the establishment of Zion. And you, of your own free will and choice, you make this covenant. So a lot of people are saying, aren't you entering into communism by doing that? And I would say no. And I said, this is the difference. One of the elements of United Order and the law of consecration is that you have to give in order to receive. Well, I say, what's the difference between that and the law of exchange?
Right.
Of voluntary exchange. You give something, you offer something in return for what you want. If you're selling a product, you're offering a product in exchange for the money for that product. And it's the voluntary exchange. Whether it be a service, a product, you name it. Even money. I'm willing to give you money if you give me that product. I'm willing to give you money if you do this service for me. So you give in order to receive. That's part of the free enterprise system. Secondly, and I'm kind of losing my train of thought here, but secondly, another thing that, when you come into an association with people, you're setting up a company to do business. You enter this company of your own free will and choice, and you have bylaws in this company on how dividends, profits are going to be dispersed, how obligations you're going to take on. And then if you happen to be an officer in the company, you're given your duties, you're given your pay. All of these things are agreed upon, and you're obligated to act according to that contract legally. But you can't call that communism because you've entered into an association voluntarily with other people.
Correct.
And right. I like to add on to that. And companies or businesses are formed to make profit for, to stimulate the economy for everyone else, and so that you can make a living, and have an increase in your own personal life. The same idea was there with the principle of law of consecration and with the practice of United Orders in the church. where you do consecrate the things that you have that are more than needful for you. But the idea was that you were always improving on your stewardship. And as you had that yield of improvements returned to you, that again, you could consecrate and charitably the excesses that your family and your stewardship did not need, that those improvements would be yielded to the church and to the bishop for those in Zion. But the idea is not that everyone's being made equal and cut down to equality, but everyone is actually being more fruitful and multiplying and making the whole thing more abundant.
So with socialism, I think what you see, whatever form of socialism you're talking about, you see that, right? We will bring everybody down to the same level. When I look at United Order and Law of Consecration, we're going to bring everybody up, right?
Yeah, right.
And so there's a different mindset there. Would you guys mind if I just read D&C 42 verses 30 through 39 real quick?
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the ones I was in a quote, so you go for it.
Because I feel like that this lays it out real well. Like, I feel like after reading this, if anybody has an idea that this is a socialist, communist kind of religious hybrid, this is going to blow it out of the water.
Right.
So it starts in verse 30, and it says, "And behold, thou wilt remember the poor and consecrate of thy properties for their support, that which thou hast to impart unto them, with a covenant and a deed which cannot be broken. And inasmuch as ye impart your substance unto the poor, ye will do it unto me, and they shall be laid before the bishop of my church and his counselors, 2 of the elders or high priests, such as shall appoint or has appointed and set apart for that purpose. And it shall come to pass that after they are laid before the bishop of my church, and after he has received these testimonies concerning the consecration of the properties of my church, that they cannot be taken from the church, agreeable to my commandments, every man shall be made accountable unto me a steward over his own property, or that which he has received by consecration, as much as is sufficient for himself and family. And again, if there shall be properties in the hands of the church or individuals of it, more than is necessary for the support after the first consecration, which is the residue, to be consecrated unto the bishop, it shall be kept to administer to those who have not from time to time, that every man who has need may be amply supplied and receive according to his wants. Therefore, the residue shall be kept in my storehouse to administer to the poor and the needy, and shall be appointed by the high council of the church and the bishop and his council. And this for the purpose of purchasing lands for the public benefit of the church, and building houses of worship, and building up of the new Jerusalem, which shall be hereafter revealed, that my covenant people may be gathered in one in that day when I come to my temple. And this I do for the salvation of my people. And it shall come to pass that he that sinneth and repenteth not shall be cast out of the church, and shall not receive again that which he has consecrated unto the poor and the needy of my church, or in other words, unto me. For inasmuch as ye do it unto the least of these, ye do it unto me. For it shall come to pass, which I spake by the mouth of my prophet shall be fulfilled. For I will consecrate of the riches of those who embrace my gospel among the Gentiles unto the poor of my people who are of the house of Israel. So as I've read this a lot, and I've never, lived in a United Order yet. I don't know what it would be like, but I can imagine the scenario after reading that. And I'm just going to try to piece it together here, and you guys tell me what you think. My idea of consecration or United Orders, you go to the bishop and you consecrate all you have. And before deeds are signed over, because deeds are signed over, it's very clear in the Doctrine and Covenants that's what happens. You give a deed, you get a deed back.
Right.
And there's a meeting of the minds there where you talk about sufficiency with the bishop, right? What do you need in order for your family to not just survive, but probably be a little comfortable as well? What is it you need? And you hash it out with the bishop back and forth. Then deeds are exchanged. And then off your land, again, you go to your bishop every year and say, this is what my land produced. This is what I produced. This was my stewardship. This is what I did with it. I increased it. You hash out again what you need for your family, plus a little, I would imagine. And then the rest goes to consecration, back to taking care of people. And again, you're constantly looking at building, because the Lord's smart enough to realize that as stewards, we can do a good job of managing that and growing it. Does that sound like I'm off base at all, or I've missed it?
No, it's exactly my view. I will say this. Joseph Smith made a statement talking about this exchange between the consecrator and the bishop who is receiving the consecration. He asked the question, who determines what the consecration is? He says, if you leave it to the bishop, then you're giving the bishop more authority than the king has. Says, but if you leave it up to the consecrator, you're making a slave out of the bishop. He says they have to come into agreement. And as he said, if they cannot come into agreement, it is to be had before the high council. And after that, they make a ruling as to what it is. But after the ruling of the high council, if the consecrator doesn't like it, then the only thing they do is they don't receive this consecration. And they say, but you don't get the blessings attending to it. It's really interesting because Bishop Partridge, when they first started this in Missouri, Bishop Partridge he was bothered about giving deeds of stewardship to the people that were receiving these consecrations. And he started to say, well, you have freedom to work the land and everything, but you'll just lease it. And the church will retain title. Well, he got a letter from Joseph Smith scolding him over it. And I'd like to read that to you. It says, a leader of the church in Missouri finally wrote to Joseph Smith on the subject of giving deeds and receiving contributions from brethren. On April 21st, 1833, the prophet replied, I have nothing further to say on the subject than to recommend that you make yourselves acquainted with the commandments of the Lord and the laws of the state and govern yourselves accordingly. 10 days later, however, in a special letter to Bishop Partridge, he wrote, concerning inheritances, you are bound by the law of the Lord to give a deed, securing him who receives inheritances, his inheritance for an everlasting inheritance, or in other words, to be his individual property, his private stewardship. If he has found a transgressor, he should be cut off out of the church. His inheritance is his still. And he is delivered over to the buffetings of Satan till the day of redemption. But the property which he consecrated to the poor for the benefit and inheritance and stewardship, in other words, his surplus, he cannot obtain again by the law of the Lord. Thus you see the propriety of this law, that rich men cannot have power to disinherit the poor by obtaining again that which they have consecrated. But it's interesting that people that receive an inheritance, including the rich guy that's the consecrating, he receives back a deed of stewardship. It says that even if he was to aposatize, he can't touch it. One of the reasons, when I was in the All Red group, I was invited on 2 occasions to join an order. One was in Eagle Mountain, and the other one was down in Rocky Ridge. So I asked them if I could look over the ordinances of those orders, and I read them. And then I declined. I says, I don't want to join. I say, why not? And I says, because you're right, you're violating the law of stewardship. How so? It says right here that if you fall out of harmony with the first elder, in this case, Owen Allred, that you forfeit your property.
Yeah.
And I think that violates the law as Joseph Smith established it. So I'm really glad that I looked into these things, because I think it helped me to avoid a lot of pitfalls that I think a lot of people don't see. And that is, they don't understand the details in how the law of consecration and united order work. But anyway, Joseph Smith, in regards to socialism, I'll just read you a couple of quotes on that. Oh, it's the other book, that little one.
Was where'd it go?
The doc. Oh, it's right behind it.
There you go. 33 and 37.
Volume 6 of the History of the Church, page 33 is the first one. It's just a really short note in somebody's journal. Thursday, the 14th. This is September 14th, 1843. I attended a second lecture on socialism by Mr. Finch. And after he got through, I made a few remarks alluding to Sidney Rigdon and Alexander Campbell getting up a community at Kirtland, and of the big fish there eating up all the little fish. I said I did not believe the doctrine. So there you have Joseph Smith. Yeah, pretty straightforward. And then in page 37, he says, this is on the 24th of the same month, September 24th, 1843. I preached on the stand about 1 hour on the second chapter of Acts, designing to show the folly of common stock. But anyway, so those are two direct statements from Joseph Smith stating his disapproval of socialism. I don't have the source right now with me, but I read a statement by Lorenzo Snow where he said, United Order is not French communism.
That's great.
I read another one. I think the name of the book was called Living the Law of Consecration in Modern Times, or something like that. And they had a quote from John Taylor in it, where John Taylor said that a corporation, this is when corporations were first coming out, said a corporation is a good model of the United Order.
Wow.
So all of those things reek of free market capitalism.
Yeah, and even the scriptures, even DNC 42 makes reference to that, right? That's a stewardship, right? And I find it interesting that whenever the Lord speaks of a stewardship, especially in the New Testament, he expects you to grow it. You're not just given it to even just maintain it. He expects you to add to it. You know, the parable of the talents, right? What are you going to do with what's been given you? And I think, to me, that alludes to the fact that I think the Savior not only was giving a metaphor about personal improvement, which is often the way that it's looked at, right? About, you know, improving upon the gifts the Lord has given you personally. You know, you may have a gift for, you know, whatever it is, whatever spiritual gift you have. But I think, based on the fact that you see in Acts, them trying to set up a community, the Lord has taught this, right? The Lord himself, I believe, was giving instruction. This is how this society should work. You should grow your stewardship, because not only are you going to benefit from it, but you're going to be able to administer to the poor tenfold.
Right. And I wanted to say one more thing, and for some reason it slipped my mind. But I think I've come to the point where I think I've said pretty much everything I can on the subject. Yeah, I can't think of what I was going to say, but I promise it was good. But it slipped my mind, so I guess that'll have to be saved for a different time. But
I think I'd just like to add something, and maybe it'll, help you. I don't know, of course. When I was very young, we the church got away from using the term, but we used to call it free agency. Now we just call it agency in the common lingo of the church. Throughout the scriptures and throughout the teachings of the prophets, I actually wonder if John Taylor was the first person to coin the term free agency based on the 1886 revelation, where the Lord told him it was more pleasing to him that men would use their free agency in regards to fulfilling the laws of plural marriage as they were revealed. But when you look to the scriptures, and when you look at what we've been taught regarding the controversies in the first estate, God is bound to not infringe on our free agency, or agency, however you'd like it. And so any system that is proposed by God, by revelation, including law of consecration and united order, it could not be based off of a principle that God is bound not to violate. It has to be without compulsory means. And you read that in D&C 121, according to the priesthood, that if you magnify these virtues and seek to have these virtues in your life, it says that that through your scepter, through your power, that these things will flow unto you without compulsory means, and that your dominion will be everlasting. And it's just based on principle. When you embody principles, when you the truth of them, when you have the law of God written on your heart and you seek to be a light on a hill, those things will flow unto you naturally when you live the law. You reap what you sow, essentially. But you can't violate the rights and liberties and property of other people without violating those laws. And then it will not flow unto you if you do violate those laws of agency. You see that with China, you see that with Russia, you see that in the United States, even at this point, for Pete's sake. And so to remedy or to address the question that you have on people in my generation and younger essentially being taught and having this idea that the United Order is equivocal to socialism, I'd like to say to those people who are even toying with that idea that it's not based on correct principle, and that it will not flow. It will not yield, blessings. It will not yield increase. And it all goes back to charity. Do you love your fellow man enough to serve them, to give what you have that you don't need to them? I'm reading a book called The Blessings of Abraham, Becoming a Zion People by E. Douglas Clark. And he does an interesting thing where he says in the Hebrew scriptures, they don't have a word for charity, because the way that we use charity in the English language doesn't really compute with the way that it's actually used in the scriptures originally. And when you think of charity, it has a certain connotation. In our language, there's a certain image. It's kind of this bleeding heart, idea, but it's so much, true charity is so much more than that. And he uses the Hebrew word, which is called hesed. And the definition he gives is simply God's loving kindness. So charity is God's loving kindness,
Right.
He even goes on to say that according to the rabbinical scholars, that God made the world because of hesed, or charity, because of the loving kindness that he had for the covenant that he would yet make with Abraham. It was for Abraham's sake and for Abraham's family that he even made the world. And so when you have those principles written on your hearts, then it can work. But if that, and I'll just like to, what Satan proposed in that council, offering his services but not offering himself, was the exact opposite of that principle. And just like we established through looking at what socialism is, the big fish eating the little fish, there's an oligarchy that's usually associated with it that reaps all the benefits, and you have the party elite living in big mansions, and everyone else is reduced to slums. That's what Satan wanted. He wanted the glory. The two things fit like a hand in a glove to me, and there's no other two ways about it.
Yep.
I figured out what I was going to say, because actually what he was talking about triggered the thought. Now, one of the advantages to being bilingual is to sometimes you can glean more meaning from what you're reading in either language. And what I'm about to say is one of those cases. Now, I want to start by asking you, you know what a butler is, right?
Yep.
And you know what a butler represents in the manor. He basically is the representative of the Lord of the manor. So he has complete agency to act on behalf of his master or the Lord of that manor. He governs the estate, takes care of everything. He has full agency to govern it. And occasionally he renders an account to the Lord of the manor as to the status of that estate. Well, you know how to say butler in Spanish?
I don't. I have a hard enough time with English. I can't speak another language.
But I'm getting to a point with this. Bear with me.
No, you're good.
A butler in Spanish is mayordomo. Now, do you know what the word for steward in Spanish is?
No.
Mayordomo.
Wow. That's profound.
So when you look at a steward in that light, a steward, we're not really owners of our bodies, we're only stewards of them.
Mm-hmm.
But we have complete agency to act with God's property, which is our body. We have it for a season. And then we have to render an account of what we did with it. But we're given full agency. And Joseph Smith explained that man cannot be, actually it was the Lord who said it himself, that man cannot be held accountable for that which he does not control. And it's his purpose that all men may be held accountable. So this is why I believe that this ties in with the kingdom a little bit, because Christ being the King of Kings, you got to have something to have sovereignty over.
Right.
In order to be accountable to your presiding king. And he in turn is accountable to his presiding king. And this is how the race of the gods propagates throughout the universe.
Yeah, that's how every god operates in relation to their extended divine family.
So I dare say that if you accept socialism and communism and confuse it with the law of consecration, is to deny the lineage of the gods.
I would agree with that, and I'd like to add a comment supplementary to that. Knowing that through law of consecration that you're essentially acknowledging, this is so interesting. I mean, you acknowledge that God is the owner, you know, and that you're the steward, right? That he owns the property, but you have complete agency over it. What is the promise that we are given, though, if, you know, this is so interesting, that we inherit all that the Father has, you know, and so that we are promised to become co-owners with God and all the other gods with him. Right. And so that's so interesting to me that we get to come up to that level and be a joint heir with Christ, or a co-heir with God at that level where, yes, it is his, but it will be ours if we are faithful. Right. And then we have the privilege then of extending that covenant relationship to others yet.
No, I think that's great. Sean, what you said back there, and you too, Michael, was really profound, and I think it sheds a lot of light on it. Although, Sean, you scared the crap right out of me when you said that we're going to be responsible for accounting for our bodies, because I got a lot of explaining to do about the Doritos and sitting on the couch. But you got some sweet gold. Yeah, no, I get you. I'm right there with you.
Hey, we have all things in common, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I got a lot of explaining for the Diet Pepsi and Doritos I tend to down. You know, I guess I want to say, and this will be the last thing I say, and you guys can if there's anything else you want to say, I want to say this. It's that for anybody listening, and I'm hoping that somewhere there's a BYU student who gets a hold of this. When you start looking and trying to make communism and law of consecration or united order the same thing, you have to judge them by their fruits.
Indeed.
First and foremost, one in communism has always, without fail, led to a stifling of man's freedom and has led to bloodshed and death on a massive scale. More people have died from communism and socialism than in all other wars ever combined. And that was peacetime in those countries. At the end, Mao said, let's stop giving people names and just give them numbers. The other leads to charity, brotherly love, mutual success. It elevates mankind. So judge them by their fruits and then see if they come from the same tree or if they're compatible.
Absolutely.
All right. Is there anything else you guys want to add?
No, I think I've emptied out my brain today. So,
dude, you guys are awesome. I love you guys. We just did 2 hours and 45 minutes, and it seemed like an hour is all. I can't appreciate you being here. I can't tell you how much I appreciate you being here. I mean, I'm just thinking back to what we covered, man. This is going to be one of those epic episodes, and I can't wait to share it with everybody. So, yeah, if there's nothing else, guys, again, I love you. I appreciate you being here. And for everybody listening, we'll talk to you next episode. Bye.